Hello again, and welcome to episode 3 of Scottish Tenants News. And back in the hot seat, we have Norman Cunningham, who liked it so much the first time he wanted to have a second shot. But I think the reason that we wanted to go back on this, Norman, is it was some things that he wanted to talk about, the origins of the housing crisis in New Zealand and things like that. We didn't get to elaborate on because it has a bearing on us in Scotland.
Aye. It's a direct correlation with what's happening in Scotland is already well advanced in New Zealand in terms of their housing crisis, and didn't quite cover it in the last video. So I just wanted to elaborate on that because it's in terms of Scotland, watch this space because it's going exactly the same way.
Well, you say that, Norman. I mean, I wonder if you maybe start from the top. I mean, you were talking before about how the New Zealand government, after the war, when they were implementing a kind of social democracy or a welfare state, they bought houses. Or can you maybe talk a wee bit more about that?
Aye. So the New Zealand government effectively subsidised mortgages to encourage people to get into their own house rather than go down the route of massive lots and lots of social housing. The idea was that people could get into their own house, and they were assisted to do that. And at the time, it was seen as a good thing to do. It's still seen as a good thing to do, but the subsidies no longer exist. But anyway, what happened was a lot of people. New Zealand essentially became a home-owning country, and the boost to the economy from buying building materials and people doing up their own houses, etc., etc. So that went on over the years. And pretty much my generation, the baby boomer generation, were the people who benefited hugely from this. So over the years, as the houses increased in value, the equity that was built up by the people who got into them through subsidized mortgages started to build up equity in them. And it became the thing where people thought, well, if we use that equity to buy a second home or another property and rent that out, that will be our retirement fund. And in itself, that was seen as quite a good thing. So people were looking at boosting they're not relying so much on the state for any sort of pension for their retirement. They were providing quite a lot of them. They'd buy a rundown property and fix it up themselves and then put it out to the rental market at a reasonable rent. It was seen as quite a good thing to do and help the economy, help the overall housing situation, etc. So that was all in good. That was basically the 70s, the 80s. That was plodding on like that. But as neoliberal economics took over, as a result of the '83 Labour government who came in, again a Labour government bringing in neoliberal politics, there was the whole economy opened up in terms of people's ability to make money, and on the back of that, slowly housing became a commodity rather than somewhere for people to live and make a home. So the people essentially became greedy in terms of, instead of having one rental property, they started to look at increasing equity. As house prices went up, more equity, will buy a second rental property and a third and a fourth. And I've got friends in New Zealand, working class guys, who've got a property portfolio of places, and it in the main, to start with, it wasn't as avaricious as it's become. People were particularly like tradesmen or people with skills, or the new Kiwis pride themselves on their practicalities, and that every Kiwi's a builder or an engineer or something in their spare time. They've often said Kiwis work harder on the weekends than they do during the week. So everybody would have a tow bar on their car and a trailer, and you'd be running around getting building materials and all the rest of it. And they would go and buy an old property, fix it up, and put it out to the market. And slowly they would acquire more and more homes. So the social housing sat at the very edge of the rental market, and was seen as very much the housing of last resort for people. And consequently, majority of people in the vast majority of people in social rented accommodation were Maori or Pacific Island people, because they've always been at the bottom of the heap. And the rest of the rental market was these mom and pop investors, and the who slowly built up a small portfolio. Subsequently to that, people have become property investors. Investors have moved in big time, and this is when the housing market really took off in terms of inflation. People were snapping up these properties to rent out, because as the prices of the houses increased, there were less and less people able to get onto the housing market as first-time buyers. So they were forced into rental accommodation. So by increasing by inflating the house prices, the investors were creating their own rental market. So, and it's inflated now to the extent where there are lots and lots of people in New Zealand who cannot afford any form of housing. They can't afford to get into the rental market because, again, if you're looking at putting up, the average rent somewhere like Auckland or Wellington is around $700 or $800 a week, which equates to £350 a week, and you've got to put up 2 months' rent as a bond. People just can't afford it. They haven't got that. They can't save enough to get the bond together to move into a rental property, let alone the deposit to buy a house in the first place. So what's being created is this huge housing crisis in terms of people either paying rent and buying food and got no money left for anything else. There are people who can afford to pay the rent but can't afford to buy enough food. Hence, there's been a huge explosion in food banks and charities in New Zealand supplying people with food. The people at the bottom end of the housing supply chain, the really poor people, because there's not enough, they will never be able to get into a private rental, and there aren't enough social houses, so the government put them up in motels. So motels are essentially one-room accommodation units for people travelling. They're overnight stays, maybe 2-3 nights in a motel, and people move on. Mostly it's one night and people move on and travelling. And they have basic facilities in the room. You'll have a kettle and some tea and coffee making facilities. Generally no kitchen. There might be a communal kitchen, communal laundry facilities. And the figures I've researched just very recently, the New Zealand government are paying $1 million per day to keep people in motel accommodation. So, and these people in motels, these are families. These are people with 2 and 3 kids living in a one-room motel unit, sharing laundry facilities, sharing kitchens, and a lot of them are getting kicked out during the day. Come back at 6 o'clock. So they're wandering the streets, sitting in parks or whatever, sitting in it's really, really shocking. As a result, well, 2 sides of it. Motel owners who have opened their places for this, generally at the bottom end of the motel market, they're getting $1,000 a week for this accommodation from the government, guaranteed. So seem to be quite happy with it. But they do complain that all of a sudden they've got some antisocial behaviour going on, because when people are stuck in that sort of those conditions, they drink, they do drugs, and it's not the perfect environment for raising kids, for God's sake. It were intended that majority of people would be in this accommodation for 2 weeks. There are lots of instances of people being in these situations for up to a year. So the situation in New Zealand, in terms of, you've got ever more people owning more and more property. So there are ever more people needing to rent because they can't afford to get into the market. It used to be the New Zealand rite of passage was, when you got married, a young couple, they'd save their money for 2 or 3 years, put it on a deposit on a house, and move in, to a fairly modest house and start a family. And slowly over the years, as the equity increased and the possible promotions at work increased, that they would look at moving up the housing ladder, etc. That has totally gone. A lot of the only people, new people getting into the market are relying on the bank of mum and dad, who've probably got 3 or 4 properties or enough money saved over the years to provide a deposit. So that's one side. The other side of the coin are people paying huge rents for an ever decreasing availability of rental properties. So it's not that the rental property is decreasing, it's the number of people who need to rent are increasing rapidly. So drawing the parallel with what I see happening in Scotland and in Glasgow locally is, again, as properties, rentable properties, and you see them advertised as such, ideal rental property, are being snapped up by investors. The rents increase to cover their mortgages or whatever, and slowly the rental properties are becoming inaccessible to people who are looking to rent privately, because they either choose not to be on the social renting waiting list, or they earn too much to qualify for social rent, but they don't earn enough to save up a deposit for ever increasing house prices. And where it's heading in, the one redeeming factor in Scotland is that we've still got a fair supply. No, wrong word, not fair. We have a supply of social housing, much greater than, I draw the parallel between New Zealand and Scotland because we both have the same population. There's 5 million people in each country. And per head of population in Scotland, we've got a lot more social housing. We've got a history and a tradition of social housing, but we don't have enough.
Well, that's right, Norman. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s, you had at one point about 70% of Scots staying in public housing. And, it took various forms: council housing, Scottish special housing. I mean, your flat here in the Wynford, that was Scottish special housing. And it was constructed by, what's his face, Socialist Plan for Scotland. Anyway, that was the thing. I forget the boy's name, but it was the Secretary of State for Scotland at the time, Willie Ross. Willie Ross. And, that was a big public housing push. But it seems that, we've got now a quarter of the housing stock is social housing. And part of that's right to buy. We lost 500,000 homes to the right to buy. So if you add up all the housing scheme properties, whether they're owner occupied or, privately let or social housing, it's a little bit more than half the housing stock in the country. But, you look at the likes of the GHA, demolished nearly 40,000 homes and built 3,000. So it seems that the government and society, the idea is get yourself on the housing ladder, and public money is used for, first time buyers. It's always the first time buyers. So where do you think in relation to New Zealand and Scotland, things start to really go wrong. Because I mean, things have gone wrong in Scotland, but they're not. They're not like the situation you're describing. They're not like London and the southeast of England, where there's whole places where there's only about 5% social housing stock.
So where I see it, the main difference was the drive in New Zealand. Government supported home ownership in terms of cheap mortgages back in the late 50s, 60s, 70s. That you created a culture of home ownership, essentially. The difference, and so what we're saying, they're saying in New Zealand now is that culture continues in terms of people's expectations. So there's an expectation amongst the younger generation who have grown up with their parents and their neighbours and everybody owning their properties around them. There's whole towns where there are virtually no social housing. So it's not part of their lived experience. And where there is social housing, it's usually been quite run down and not desirable. So the cultural expectation in New Zealand is that you will eventually own your own home, and that home ownership has created the inflation. If everybody expects to own a house, then it pushes the house prices up, which pushes up the rents of the ones that are the privately owned houses that are on the rental market. What I've seen in Scotland since I've come back from New Zealand is the aspirations. That word is new in the vocabulary of people in the housing market, is that people now, I'm told, aspire to own their own home. Now, that's a relatively new phenomenon in Scotland. There's a whole large section of the population, or young people, aspiring to own their own home. Hence, the government, and it's been encouraged by the government with their affordable homes for first-time buyers, etc., etc. So there's a whole push happening away from social housing. My generation in Scotland, it brought up in, say, the slum tenements. Our aspirations was to get a council house with hot and cold running water and an inside toilet. Mm-hmm. So people seem to see it as progress, that the aspirations change ever upwards, that people now aspire to own their own home. That's all great and good if you also accept that when you step into that situation, you become locked into being a wage slave in order to keep paying your mortgage. You then are subject to the market rates of interest, whatever, and at the moment, very low interest rates. So it seems to be attractive to be in, you're buying your own house compared to renting in the private sector. I'm told that there are mortgages which are cheaper than rents in the private sector, so it's even more attractive. Wait until there's something goes wrong in these big global markets and interest rates rise rapidly. At one time in New Zealand, interest rates on mortgages were 21%. I kid you not. And that was around the time when they brought in the neoliberal policies, the mid-80s in New Zealand, 21% interest rates. So, and it took a long while to come down from there. So there are lots of things I could say about the dangers of buying into this private housing market. And it seems to be, it's pushed as an alternative to the private rental market, to the degradation of the socially rented, the public rented housing. Mm-hmm. So rather than put money into public rented housing, the money is going into the private sector, which is, again, I mean, the perfect example of Glasgow City Council selling land that used to be, have several hundred socially rented houses on it. They've all been demolished in 2007, and this is Kalina Street I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And the council are selling that land for a private housing development, or trying to sell it, which is, in a nutshell, what's happening surreptitiously in the rest of the country. So this big move towards everybody all of a sudden becoming, it's never going to happen that everybody will be able to own their own home, to the detriment of the private rental sector, and more importantly, to the public rented sector.
I can't remember if it's a UK statistic or a Scottish statistic, Norman, but the actual number of people who own their homes is not radically different from the 1970s. The difference being now that we've got a lot more people in the private rented sector. But I'm interested in this, which I like, the political imaginary, because you were talking about the way that young people, the idea of home ownership is that's been really pushed. But the reality is that with your average house price in Glasgow over £200,000, how do you get that other than through the bank of mum and dad? I mean, obviously the newspapers are full of stories of I'm 19 and I saved to buy a house and all this kind of nonsense. But with the idea that what you need is home ownership, but what you've got is a private rent. There's this creation of this generation rent kind of culture, but they don't have the political imaginary of what we need is more public housing to resolve this problem.
Aye, it's there's a stigmatizing of what we call it, publicly owned housing or socially rented housing. I don't know which is the better terminology, but the fact that the state essentially is reluctant to become a landlord. The whole, and this is a very neoliberal Tory outlook on the world, is that the government should be hands off everything, and it should all be left to the market, and the market will resolve everything. And so it goes from the fact that you've got young people who can have a lot easier access to credit than it ever happened in my young days. So a lot of young people, it's my niece, who's, she's not young anymore. I tend to think of her still as a wee lassie, but she's 35. And she's got several wardrobes full of clothes that she's maybe worn once. She's got innumerable pairs of shoes and boots and all the rest of it. And she's just waiting for, she's not waiting. She still lives at home with mum, and she will inherit that house eventually. But in terms of her friends and things, none of them have spoken with them. None of them have even got their name on any waiting list for public housing. They're either renting privately or hopefully thinking that they might marry the right guy who's got some money and buy a private place or whatever. So the whole culture, the whole outlook, what we're moving towards now is that where, as Nick was describing, that it was perfectly normal to live in a council house. Lots of people did. Whereas now it's slowly becoming stigmatized. It's becoming seen as, unless you own your council house, if you're still actually renting your council house, and you're now classified as somehow being dependent on the state. And we end up we're creating new slums because there's not much investment goes into maintaining the houses, the council houses, and you've got the situation where less and less people have access to housing of any sort. So we're not quite at the stage where the government is paying $1 million a day to keep people in motels. We don't have motels as such in Scotland as they do New Zealand. The motel market, if you like, is very much based on America. So but what you've got in Scotland, we've got B&Bs. People get put up in B&Bs, which are dreadful places to raise children. It's terrible. It's one step from a hostel, and it's desperation stakes. We can't. It's not a good look to have families living on the street, so we got to park them somewhere. and out of sight, out of mind. It seems to be these days. So, whereas in New Zealand, it's actually quite visible, the housing crisis. People living in friends' garages, or even landlords renting out garages that are attached to houses.
Like London.
Aye. So we're slowly becoming, not slowly, quite rapidly becoming those housing crises that it's being experienced in the States, Australia, Canada, lots of places around the world are slowly developing the same problems. Scotland's still a wee bit ahead of the curve, but we're really heading that way. And it's exemplified by the privatising of the land at Kalina Street and the demolition of 600 flats in the Wynford that's going to be taking place. And so I just want, it alarms me that these situations are allowed to take place without much discussion. There's nothing in the media that I see about it. There's nothing highlighting the dangers of where we're heading. And essentially, it was always explained to me that one of the reasons that Scotland was such a great place to live was that the middle class had a social conscience, and that drove a lot of the initiatives in Scotland to look after each other. And I see that being totally eroded to the point where even working people are split and divided. And now that you've got these young working class people with totally different aspirations to my generation, and I'm really trying hard not to be harking back to the good old days, because they weren't good old days. But I don't actually see where we're at now as being any progress from how things were. We're progressing to a worse situation, and that's what frightens me. That's what makes me sad to see that people don't realise exactly what's happening. So we're ghettoising people in social housing, and it's not about to be addressed and turned around.
Well, in the last days of the Scottish Tenants Organisation, they launched a campaign. I'm old enough to remember, it was 2007. Launched a campaign, Scotland's for council housing, and the call was for 100,000 homes to be built, public homes, in one parliament. And they always use the phrase public because social was a weasel word invented by a Tory MP.
Right.
And that's kind of why people promoting the home ownership agenda have cottoned onto that to obscure the fact that it's public sector housing. But the 100,000 homes in one parliament, at the last election, there were two parties proposing exactly that. You had the Labour Party and you had the Alba Party, and they both proposed 100,000 homes in one parliament. And it was pointed out to me at the time the availability of money on the bonds market for governments is an all-time high. There has never been an easier time to do public works, and yet we don't see the public works. It's almost like that political imaginary that we were talking about in terms of young people don't see it. It's not in the political culture. And you mentioned Kalina Street and the fight for public housing there. I wonder if you might like a comment or any thoughts on how that could be taken to another level.
In terms of, okay, so what I sort of joining in with what you've just said and agreeing with it, what I see happened was this whole stigmatizing of public housing. We'll continue to call it public housing. Was lack of investment, or let them run down and appear to be undesirable places to live. They were undesirable, like the peripheral schemes in Glasgow were undesirable to start with, from purely a design point of view. Stuck in the wilderness and no amenities, no facilities, etc., etc. And then from there, they were allowed to run down with minimum maintenance, etc., etc. So they were seen as, from that point of view, as being undesirable. And then it was that they were too expensive to maintain. So there's been this whole propaganda in that direction. What we're looking at, and so making them, not part of anybody's aspirations to live. No one inspired to live in Drumchapel or Easterhouse for all the reasons: bad housing, no facilities, no amenities, and the resultant antisocial behaviour that sprung from that. You build you put people in brutal housing conditions, and you'll produce brutal people. Is essentially what well proven. So what I was looking at, and the people involved in the campaign for the community buyout at Cunningham Street, was to build really, really high quality public housing, built to, say, passive house standards, which means that you eliminate fuel poverty for a start, warm, dry, attractive housing, and based within a situation where you've got community enterprises, where you're creating work for people, with creating hope for people's children, for employment, etc. Creating an environment that is aspirational, that is providing people with quality of life. And in that situation, then it's been shown around the world that if you create those the facilities, people will embrace that and look after it themselves. People will be proud of where they live, and everything that springs from that, all the good bits. It's like, I'm sure the levels of antisocial behaviour in Bearsden and Newton Mearns is a lot lower than it is in Easterhouse and Pollock. Why is that? Why is that? And it's not just about money. It's poverty of hope, poverty of imagination, poverty of the ability of people thinking that they can actually create a better environment, particularly for their children, a better future. And so if we manage to get the community buyout in Cunningham Street, and that wee bit of land there, it's perfectly situated in terms of its geography and all the rest of it, to actually create a model example of what public housing could be. And this would be public housing owned by the people who live in it, not owned by Glasgow City Council or a housing association or anybody else relying on funding, etc. It could be totally self-supporting. And that is the model I see that could be adopted for the future, and would certainly create aspirations for people in the surrounding community, working class community, to show them that there's an alternative to becoming a wage slave to pay a bank or some other lending institution for the next 30 years of your life, and be subject to the vagaries and stresses created by financial markets that are totally out of your own control. And you end up living a life in perpetual debt. And that's what the example you pass on to your children. I don't think it's something that I don't call that progress, to be honest.
I recall the first chair of the Glasgow Housing Association. He became an advocate. The guy's name was Sam. I forget his surname, but I'll find it for the foot in the bottom when we do the editing. But his argument for housing stock transfer at the time was he had made a really nice house, as a builder to trade, and he'd really decorated his place. He'd made it his own, but his family moved out. He wanted a smaller house. He wanted to retire, and he passed it back to the council, and the council ripped everything out, everything. So he knew that there was going to be a young family moving in there, and all this work he'd done had just been undone by the council and its bureaucracy. and this idea of taking ownership was what drove him to support the GHA. He then, as chair of the GHA, became a critic, a high-profile critic of housing stock transfer. But it was that drive to control things rather than to be remotely controlled that was a big driver of that. And obviously, in the past, when there was more public housing, that was very much to the fore. You had the tenant management cooperatives, yeah, and the letting agreements, and people often talk about the high flats we're in, Norman, and they say, "Oh, things are really bad." But again, that's a question of the allocations. But in the past, people in this community, for example, had control of those allocations. So it's interesting, that aspect of control and sort of working class sovereignty.
Oh, totally. It's always been, we will live in the UK, and Scotland as part of the UK, and probably has been before we were the UK, in a class society. It's it's that the people who have inherited the wealth or the titles and the power know better than us. They're, and probably traditionally that was true, is that they were the only ones who could afford to be educated, and it was in their interest to make sure that not too many people got educated, otherwise they might have got their asses kicked. So what we're seeing now, in terms of how it flowed down through social housing and socialism as such, was we still had hierarchies. We still have it to this day, where there's people in the council think they know better than the people who are living in the communities that they are making monumental decisions about. They never, and it flows on to people like the GHA. The GHA are now just a branch of the Glasgow City Council, and everything but name. The profit-making branch of Glasgow City Council, and the tokenism of supplying public housing. So these people still think they know better. Not once did anybody come and talk to people in these high flats to discuss the possible demolition. We were just told it's happening. And so this is a direct result of other people know better than the people that they're providing the service to, supposed service. And they don't see that. They see that they're almost some sort of benefactors, that they're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts to give me a roof over my head. And so we're fighting this class war and social engineering that goes with it. These people think they know best. I'm sure, the majority of them have no malevolence. They have no ulterior motive. They're just doing what they've learned to do, and they would probably argue that what they're doing is a good thing because they're educated and they've been taught that this is a good thing. What they won't admit reluctantly is that this is an experiment.
Yeah.
There's a huge social experiment going on here in terms of the move towards privately owned, majority privately owned accommodation, and the accommodation is now a commodity that is traded on the market to the highest bidder, and the market is subject to rises and falls and all the other vagaries that go with it. So it's huge social engineering that's happening here, and class warfare. And seems that nobody sat back and had a think about, hang on, not everybody can be middle class.
Yeah.
And there's very few people get access to the upper class.
Yeah.
And so the people who are not middle class and not upper class used to be called working class. I don't really believe in the working class anymore, because that's been eroded in terms of the working class were easily identified in the past, that they worked in shipyards and factories, and there were skills that some of them were allowed to acquire that were needed. Now the working class, goes from tradespeople down through the guy with his push bike who delivers the takeaways to other working class people. So it's all very grey at the bottom here in terms of who the working class actually are anymore. And then you've got the situation where it suits a section of society to maintain these what are they called, the gigs, these jobs that are seen as gigs, zero hours contracts, etc.
Well, that kind of touches on where that comes into housing, because you have in Scotland and the United Kingdom, much of the Western world, in fact, what they call a finance, insurance, and real estate economy. And when the banks and the big land bankers and the property developers and speculators and all that sort of that industry and the legal and accountancy part of that forms the most important part of your economy, then what becomes less and less important is the productive economy.
Yeah.
So it's by pushing this Thatcher called the property owning democracy, you're effectively saying no, you can't have high valued jobs in factories and in productive industries. You can't you can't have an economy where there's trade union rights and family wages.
Essentially, and that's exactly what's happened in New Zealand. It's what's happening in Australia, and it's not far behind it. Well, it's alive and well in the UK. The only difference I see is that the big picture of the housing situation in Scotland, particularly because we had a high percentage of public housing. It's just there's a lag between what's happening in New Zealand, for example, who never had a high percentage of public housing. The lag in Scotland is because of that, but it's being eroded all the time in that there's becoming less and less public housing, more and more private rented housing at extortionate rates. And the people who work or the people whose work only allows them to be part of the private rented sector. It doesn't provide them with enough money to save because while you're trying to save the deposit for a house, you have to live somewhere.
Yeah.
And if where you're living is taking a big majority slice of your wages, there's nothing left over to actually save to get the deposit to improve your situation by becoming a first-time buyer. So it's total catch-22. And it suits the people who own the properties who need tenants. They need tenants.
And as you said, it's a social experiment, but one where we know the outcome, because you can look at the situation in New Zealand or the situation in London and say that's where we're headed, and it's not a good place.
No. So when do we get? I'm just waiting for the day we get to the point where the government. There are so many people who cannot access public housing because there isn't enough of it. They cannot access private rental housing because they can't afford it. Where are they going to live? What then does the government do? We don't have motels here. So do we start paying £1,000 a week to put them in a hotel somewhere? Which will slowly, and if you put lots of them in the same hotel, you create terrible conditions for raising families, etc. We've already seen that with the refugees and the asylum seekers. So all of a sudden, we're going to have a big slice of the Scottish population, of the indigenous Scottish people, being put in the same housing or accommodation situation, let's call it, as refugees and asylum seekers. And yeah, I'll wait, and maybe I won't live long enough to see that day, but it's coming, because that's exactly what's happened in these other places that we're following in terms of the whole housing situation. And yeah, God forbid.
But watch this space, because we're going to stop it.
All right.